The arena was already shaking before Bruce Lee ever stepped through the doors. 10,000 people had packed into the building that night, filling every seat, every aisle, and every corner where a person could stand. The air smelled of sweat, leather, and nervous anticipation. Bright lights hung above the ring, throwing a white glow across the canvas, while thousands of faces disappeared into the darkness beyond it. This was supposed to be a celebration of martial arts. Instead, it was about to become something nobody in that arena would ever forget. Bruce Lee stood quietly behind the curtain. He wasn't wearing the expression of a man preparing for war. There was no anger in his eyes, no nervous movement, no attempt to impress anyone. He simply watched. Across the arena, another fighter stood beneath the lights. Chuck Norris. Powerful, confident, broad-shouldered, experienced. The crowd knew exactly what they were looking at. Two martial artists who had earned respect through years of discipline. But that night, respect was about to be tested. A voice came over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen." The crowd erupted. Bruce heard his name. Then Chuck Norris's. The noise became deafening. Bruce slowly looked toward the ring. For a moment, he noticed something unusual. People weren't talking about technique anymore. They were talking about reputation. Who was tougher? Who was faster? Who would win if the two men actually fought? Bruce had heard those questions before. But tonight, one man decided to turn the questions into a challenge. Chuck Norris stepped toward the microphone. The crowd immediately became quiet. He smiled. Then he said something that changed the atmosphere inside the entire arena. "People keep telling me Bruce Lee is fearless." A few people laughed. Chuck looked toward the entrance. But when it comes to a real fight, he paused. He knows when to walk away. The crowd exploded. Some laughed. Some booed. Others shouted Bruce's name. Behind the curtain, Bruce didn't move. One of his friends looked at him. "You heard that?" Bruce nodded. "Everyone heard it. You're going to let him say that?" Bruce remained silent. The friend shook his head. "Bruce, they're all waiting for you." Bruce finally looked toward the ring. "They're not waiting for me." "Then what are they waiting for?" Bruce smiled faintly. "They're waiting for a fight." The crowd continued chanting. "Bice, bice, bice." Chuck stood in the center of the ring, enjoying every second. He lifted the microphone again. "If Bruce Lee is really what everyone says he is." He pointed toward the entrance. "Then come show them." The crowd erupted again. Bruce took one slow breath. Then another. And finally, he stepped out from behind the curtain. The reaction was immediate. 10,000 people rose to their feet. Some screamed. Some clapped. Some simply stared. Bruce walked toward the ring without rushing. His footsteps were almost impossible to hear beneath the roar of the crowd. Chuck watched him approach. The smile remained on his face. But something in his eyes had changed. Bruce wasn't angry. That was the first thing Chuck noticed. He looked calm. Almost too calm. Bruce reached the edge of the ring. He stopped. For several seconds, he simply looked at Chuck. Chuck leaned toward him. "You sure about this?" Bruce stepped through the ropes. "I didn't come here to prove I'm stronger than you." The crowd suddenly became quieter. Bruce continued. "I came because you told them I was afraid." Chuck stared at him. Then he smiled. "Maybe you are." Bruce didn't answer. He simply raised his hands. The referee stepped between them. Wait for my signal. The audience fell silent. 10,000 people. One ring. Two fighters. And suddenly, there was no laughter anymore. Only anticipation. The referee looked at both men. Then stepped backward. Begin. For the first few seconds, neither fighter moved. Chuck shifted his weight. Bruce watched. Not his fists. Not his face. His feet. His shoulders. His breathing. Chuck took one step forward. Bruce took one step backward. The crowd reacted immediately. "Boo!" Someone shouted. "Don't run!" Bruce heard it. Chuck heard it. But Bruce didn't care. Chuck moved again. This time faster. A straight punch shot toward Bruce's face. Bruce slipped to the side. The punch missed. Chuck immediately followed with another. Bruce moved again. Barely. The crowd gasped. Chuck's expression became serious. He threw a third punch. Bruce disappeared from the line of attack. Again. 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 It began to look strange. Chuck was attacking. Bruce was moving. And the audience couldn't understand why Bruce wasn't fighting back. Then Chuck stopped. He stared at Bruce. "You're going to keep running." Bruce said nothing. Chuck stepped forward. "That's what you came here to do." Bruce's eyes narrowed. "No." "Then fight." Bruce raised his hands slightly. "I am." Chuck frowned. The crowd didn't understand. Neither did most of the people watching. But Bruce knew something they didn't. Every movement was information. Every punch revealed something. Every step exposed balance. Every breath showed fatigue. Bruce wasn't avoiding the fight. He was studying it. And Chuck had no idea how much Bruce had already learned. A question for everyone watching. If you were standing in that arena right now, who would you believe? Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris? If you think Bruce was preparing something, hit like. Tell us in the comments who you think would win. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more dramatic martial arts stories like this. Most importantly, tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, the Philippines, or somewhere else? Write your city or country in the comments. Because the next few minutes are where everything changes. Chuck slowly began circling Bruce. The crowd became restless. They wanted action. They wanted a knockout. They wanted to see which man would fall first. Chuck suddenly attacked. A low kick. Bruce moved his leg. A punch. Bruce slipped. Another punch. Bruce ducked. Chuck followed. Bruce moved. The rhythm continued. Attack. Escape. Attack. Escape. Finally, Chuck stopped. His breathing had become heavier. Bruce was still calm. Chuck looked at him. "You're fast." Bruce said nothing. "But you're not going to keep avoiding me forever." Bruce smiled. "You're right." Chuck raised his fists. "Good." Bruce took a small step forward. The crowd leaned in. For the first time that night, Bruce was moving toward Chuck. Chuck noticed it. His eyes sharpened. Bruce moved again. Closer. Closer. Then he stopped. Only inches separated them. The arena became silent. Chuck could hear Bruce breathing. Bruce could hear Chuck's. Neither man moved. Then Chuck whispered, "You're not afraid." Bruce looked directly into his eyes. Fear is not the problem. What is? Losing control. Chuck's jaw tightened. Then he attacked. His fist came forward with incredible speed. Bruce moved backward. The crowd screamed. He's running. Chuck heard the words. Bruce heard them too. Chuck smiled. He thought he had finally exposed him. He chased Bruce across the ring. Bruce kept moving. 1 step. 2 steps. 3. Then Chuck cornered him. The ropes were behind Bruce. The crowd erupted. Nowhere to run. Chuck raised his fists. Bruce looked around. There was nowhere behind him. No more space. No more room. Chuck stepped forward. This is it. Bruce looked at him. Then he smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not a desperate smile. A knowing smile. Chuck hesitated. For the first time that night, something felt wrong. Bruce had been moving backward for a reason. And Chuck was about to find out why. Chuck threw the punch. Bruce suddenly stepped inside. Everything happened in less than a second. His body shifted. His shoulder turned. His hand moved. And then, stop. Bruce's fist stopped just inches from Chuck's face. The entire arena went silent. 10,000 people. Not one voice. Chuck froze. He could feel the air move from the stopped punch. Bruce hadn't touched him. He didn't need to. His fist had stopped exactly where it needed to stop. Chuck stared at it, then slowly looked into Bruce's eyes. Bruce lowered his hand. You wanted me to fight. Chuck said nothing. Bruce took 1 step back. So I showed you. The crowd finally erupted. But Bruce wasn't finished. He looked around the arena. 10,000 people were watching. And suddenly, the question wasn't who was stronger. It was who had understood the fight first. Chuck lowered his fists. For the first time that evening, there was no smile on his face. Only respect. But the night still had one final lesson waiting for both men. And Bruce Lee was about to teach it without throwing another punch. For several seconds, Chuck Norris simply stood there. The arena was still roaring, but somehow, inside the ring, everything felt quiet. Bruce Lee had stopped his fist inches from Chuck's face. He hadn't struck him. He hadn't knocked him down. He hadn't even tried to humiliate him. And somehow, that was more powerful than any punch could have been. Chuck slowly lowered his hands. Bruce did the same. The referee looked from one man to the other, unsure what to do next. Then Chuck took a breath. You could have hit me. Bruce nodded. Yes. Why didn't you? Bruce looked at him for a moment. Because I didn't need to. Chuck's expression changed. Those 4 words hit harder than the punch ever could. The audience was still shouting, but Chuck barely heard them. He had spent years training to become faster, stronger, more disciplined. Yet in that moment, he realized something. Bruce wasn't trying to prove that he could hurt him. Bruce was trying to prove that he could choose not to. Chuck stepped closer. Then what was all that? Bruce looked toward the crowd. You told them I ran. Chuck nodded. I did. Bruce pointed toward the ropes. I moved because I wanted you to chase me. Chuck's eyes narrowed. And you knew I'd do it. Bruce smiled. I was counting on it. A few people in the audience heard the exchange. Then the story began spreading through the crowd. He let Chuck chase him. He was setting him up. He wasn't running. Bruce looked at Chuck. You were watching my feet. Chuck nodded. But you should have been watching your own. Chuck smiled despite himself. That was the moment the tension finally broke. The two men looked at each other. Then Chuck laughed. Not because the situation was funny. Because he had finally understood. He had been so focused on catching Bruce that he had stopped thinking. Bruce had been thinking the entire time. The referee stepped between them. Are you two finished? Chuck looked at Bruce. What do you think? Bruce shrugged. I think we already learned what we came to learn. The crowd wasn't satisfied. They wanted another exchange. They wanted Bruce and Chuck to continue. Some people shouted, "Fight!" Others shouted, "BRUCE!" Chuck raised his hand. The noise slowly faded. He took the microphone. I said Bruce Lee ran from the fight. The audience listened. Chuck looked toward Bruce. I was wrong. A massive cheer erupted. But Chuck wasn't finished. He wasn't running. He pointed toward Bruce. He was waiting. Bruce lowered his head slightly. The crowd erupted again. But then something unexpected happened. Chuck walked toward Bruce and extended his hand. Bruce looked at it, then shook it. The arena exploded. Two men who had spent the last several minutes testing one another stood face to face. No hatred, no bitterness, only respect. But the night wasn't over. Because what happened next would become the moment everyone remembered. Chuck turned toward Bruce. Show them. Bruce raised an eyebrow. Show them what? What you were doing. Bruce looked toward the audience. Thousands of people were watching. He stepped toward the center of the ring. Everyone thinks speed means moving quickly. He paused. It doesn't. The crowd became quiet. Speed means arriving before the other person realizes you have moved. Chuck nodded. Bruce continued. Strength is the same. He looked down at his hands. Strength isn't always about hitting harder. He looked back at Chuck. Sometimes strength is knowing exactly when not to hit. The arena fell silent. Then one man in the audience shouted, "Then show US." The crowd laughed. Bruce smiled. Chuck laughed too. Bruce shook his head. People always want to see the punch. He pointed toward his head. But they forget the mind creates it first. Time to hear from you. Before we continue, let's make this interactive. Imagine you were sitting among those 10,000 people that night. You just watched Bruce stop his fist inches from Chuck's face. Would you want to see Bruce throw the punch? Or would you respect him more for stopping it? Write punch or control in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more. Also, tell us where you're watching from. Write your city and country in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now listen carefully, because the next moment changes the entire atmosphere inside the arena. Bruce stepped away from Chuck. The crowd expected another demonstration. Instead, Bruce walked toward one of the younger martial artists standing near the edge of the ring. The young man looked nervous. Bruce gestured for him to come closer. What's your name? David. How long have you trained? 3 years. Bruce nodded. And what do you want? The young man hesitated. To become strong. Bruce smiled. Everyone says that. The young man looked confused. Bruce continued. What do you really want? David looked down. I don't want people to think I'm weak. Bruce's expression became serious. There. He pointed at David's chest. That is the problem. The audience became quiet. Bruce looked around. When you train because you're afraid people will think you're weak, you are still controlled by those people. He paused. When you train because you want to understand yourself, nobody can control you. David listened carefully. Chuck stood behind Bruce, listening too. Then Bruce turned toward him. That's what I was trying to explain tonight. Chuck nodded. I understand now. Bruce looked toward the audience. Most people think a fight begins when someone throws a punch. He shook his head. The fight begins much earlier. He pointed toward his eyes. It begins here. The crowd remained completely silent. You decide whether you're angry. You decide whether you're afraid. You decide whether you need to prove something. And if you cannot control those things. Bruce paused. Your opponent doesn't have to defeat you. The message hit the audience harder than any physical demonstration. Even Chuck looked thoughtful. Because Bruce wasn't really talking about fighting anymore. He was talking about life. Then a voice from the crowd interrupted. So you're saying you weren't afraid? Bruce turned toward the sound. He smiled. No. The crowd waited. I was afraid. People murmured. Bruce continued. Being fearless is not the goal. He looked at Chuck. The goal is learning what to do with fear. Chuck slowly nodded. Bruce's words reminded him of something he'd learned years earlier. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was movement despite fear. But there was one thing nobody in that arena knew. Bruce had been carrying his own doubts into that ring. He had heard the whispers. He had heard people say he was too small, too unconventional, too different. They said his style wasn't traditional enough. They said he relied on speed because he didn't have the size of larger fighters. They said his ideas were strange. And every criticism had followed him. But Bruce had never tried to silence every critic. He had simply continued training. Day after day, hour after hour, punch after punch, kick after kick, mistake after mistake. He knew something most people didn't understand. A martial artist doesn't become dangerous because he learns how to hurt people. He becomes dangerous when he learns exactly what he is capable of. And tonight, Bruce had shown that capability without throwing a single finishing blow. The crowd began chanting his name again. B-I-O-C-E, B-I-O-C-E, B-I-O-C-E. Bruce looked toward the stands. For a moment, his expression softened. He could see fathers sitting beside their sons. Young martial artists leaning forward. Older fighters watching carefully. People who had come expecting entertainment. But they were leaving with something different. A lesson. Then Chuck approached him again. There is one thing I still don't understand. Bruce looked at him. What? Chuck smiled. When you moved backward. Bruce waited. How did you know exactly when I would attack? Bruce looked at Chuck's shoulders. You told me. Chuck laughed. I didn't say anything. Bruce shook his head. Your body did. Chuck stared at him. Bruce explained. Before every punch, your right shoulder moved. Chuck looked at his shoulder. Bruce continued. Before every kick, your weight shifted. Chuck nodded slowly. And when you got angry, Bruce smiled. You stopped breathing. Chuck laughed. You noticed all that. Bruce answered calmly. That's what fighting is. The crowd applauded. But Chuck wasn't laughing anymore. He was thinking. Bruce had watched him so carefully that the fight had become almost predictable. And that realization would stay with Chuck for a long time. Then Chuck asked one final question. If you knew what I was going to do. He paused. Why didn't you finish me? Bruce looked directly at him. Because you weren't my enemy. Chuck's expression changed. Bruce continued. You were my teacher for a few minutes. Chuck stood completely still. Then he nodded. And for the first time that night, the two men weren't standing as opponents. They were standing as martial artists. Two men who understood that the greatest victories weren't always measured by who fell. Sometimes they were measured by what both men learned while standing. The crowd continued applauding. But outside the arena, another story was already beginning. People were telling their friends that Bruce Lee had been challenged. They were saying Chuck Norris had called him a coward. They were saying Bruce walked into the ring. And they were repeating the moment when his fist stopped just inches from Chuck's face. But the people who had actually been there knew something else. Bruce Lee hadn't walked into that ring to prove he was invincible. He had walked into it because someone had questioned his courage. And instead of answering with anger, he answered with control. Still, one final test remained. And this time, Bruce wouldn't be facing Chuck Norris. He would be facing the one opponent no fighter can escape. The pressure to prove himself. The pressure to become what everyone else expected. And Bruce was about to make a choice that would reveal who he really was. The arena was still alive with noise. 10,000 people had witnessed something they had not expected to see when they walked through the doors that evening. They had expected a fight. They had expected one man to dominate the other. They had expected someone to fall. Instead, they had watched Bruce Lee stop a punch before it reached Chuck Norris's face. But Bruce knew something the crowd didn't. That moment wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because the hardest opponent Bruce would face that night wasn't standing across from him. It was standing inside him. The pressure to prove himself. The pressure to silence every critic. The pressure to show everyone that he belonged. Bruce stepped out of the ring. The crowd continued chanting his name. B-I-U-C-E, B-I-U-C-E, B-I-U-C-E. He walked slowly toward the edge of the arena. A young fighter approached him. Bruce. Bruce turned. The young man was breathing heavily. You were incredible. Bruce smiled. Thank you. I thought you were going to knock him out. Bruce shook his head. I didn't need to. The young fighter looked confused. But everyone wanted you to. Bruce looked toward the crowd. That is exactly the problem. The young fighter followed his gaze. Thousands of people were still cheering. Bruce continued quietly. If I fight only because people demand it, then they control me. The young man became silent. Bruce placed a hand on his shoulder. Never let the crowd decide who you have to become. Those words stayed with the young fighter. But Bruce wasn't finished. Across the arena, Chuck Norris was speaking with several officials. One of them approached Bruce. Mr. Lee. Bruce turned. There's something you should know. What? Some people outside are saying the fight wasn't real. Bruce smiled. I expected that. They're saying you backed away because you were afraid. Bruce looked toward the exit. Let them say it. The official looked surprised. You don't want to respond. Bruce shook his head. Why? Because people will believe them. Bruce smiled. People believe whatever they want to believe. He paused. I know what happened. The official didn't understand. Bruce tapped his chest. And that's enough. Then Chuck Norris walked over. You're leaving. Bruce nodded. I've got somewhere to be. Chuck laughed. You just walked into an arena with 10,000 people watching you, nearly started a riot, and now you're leaving like nothing happened. Bruce smiled. What else should I do? Chuck shook his head. You're different. Bruce looked at him. So are you. Chuck extended his hand. Bruce shook it. Then Chuck said something quietly. I meant what I said earlier. Bruce waited. I shouldn't have called you afraid. Bruce smiled. It's okay. No. Chuck shook his head. It isn't. He looked toward the crowd. I wanted to see what you'd do. Bruce nodded. And now you know. Chuck laughed. Yes. He paused. Now I know. The two men stood silently for a moment. Then Chuck said, one day we're going to have to do this again. Bruce smiled. Maybe. Chuck raised an eyebrow. Maybe. Bruce turned toward the exit. Next time, don't chase me. Chuck laughed. Bruce walked away. The crowd watched him disappear behind the curtain. But before he left the building, something unexpected happened. A little boy was standing near the hallway. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He was holding a small pair of worn martial arts gloves. Bruce noticed him. The boy looked nervous. Bruce stopped. What happened? The boy looked down. My father says I'm too small. Bruce looked at the gloves. How long have you trained? 6 months. And you want to quit? The boy nodded. Bruce crouched down so they were at eye level. Why? Because the other boys beat me. Bruce was silent for a moment. Then he asked, do you know why you lose? The boy shook his head. Bruce picked up one of the gloves. You think losing means you're weak? The boy nodded. But you're wrong. Bruce handed the glove back. Losing tells you where you need to grow. The boy looked at him. So I shouldn't quit. Bruce smiled. Never quit because someone else says you're weak. The boy's eyes became brighter. Bruce stood. Then he said something the boy would remember for the rest of his life. Don't train to become stronger than everyone else. The boy listened. Train to become stronger than the person you were yesterday. Bruce walked away. The boy watched him disappear. He didn't know it yet, but that simple conversation would change the direction of his life. One more question for everyone watching. Imagine you were that little boy. Would you keep training after losing again and again? Or would you walk away? Comment, I would keep going, if you believe failure should make you stronger. And if this story has kept you watching, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. We also want to know something important. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city and country in the comments. It doesn't matter whether you're watching from America, Canada, the UK, India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, the Philippines, or anywhere else. Let's see how many different places are listening to Bruce Lee's story tonight. Later that evening, Bruce finally stepped outside. The noise of the arena disappeared behind him. The streets were quieter. Cool air touched his face. For the first time that night, he was alone. No crowd. No cameras. No opponent. No cheering. Just Bruce. He stopped beneath a streetlight. For a moment, he looked at his hands. Those hands had trained for years. They had been bruised, cut, swollen, exhausted. They had struck wooden boards until his knuckles hurt. They had repeated the same movements thousands of times. Not for applause, not for fame, but because Bruce understood something early in his life. Mastery was never one dramatic moment. It was thousands of ordinary moments when nobody was watching. He remembered every criticism, every person who had doubted him, every person who had told him his ideas were too strange, every person who had said he was too small, every person who had laughed when he talked about creating something different. And tonight, for a few seconds, he had felt the old pressure again, the need to prove them wrong. But standing alone beneath that streetlight, Bruce realized something. He didn't need to prove anything. Not anymore. The greatest victory wasn't defeating Chuck Norris. It wasn't making 10,000 people cheer. It wasn't stopping a punch an inch from someone's face. The greatest victory was reaching the point where another person's opinion could no longer control his emotions. Bruce looked at his reflection in a dark window. Then he smiled. He had entered the arena because someone had questioned his courage. He was leaving it with something far more valuable. Basil. The following morning, people were already talking. Some said Bruce had won. Some said Chuck had won. Some claimed the fight had never been serious. Others insisted Bruce could have knocked Chuck out. Arguments spread everywhere. But Bruce didn't participate. He went back to training. That morning, there was no audience, no spotlight, no microphone, no 10,000 people. Just a heavy bag hanging in front of him. Bruce stood in front of it. He breathed in, then out. His eyes became focused. One punch, another, another. His movements became faster, sharper, cleaner. Then he stopped. He looked at the bag and smiled, because the lesson from the previous night wasn't about Chuck Norris. It wasn't even about fighting. It was about control. Control over fear. Control over anger. Control over pride. Control over the desperate need to be admired. Bruce understood that a person could defeat an opponent and still lose himself. And a person could walk away from a fight and still become stronger. That was the difference. Outside, the world was becoming louder. Inside, Bruce was becoming quieter. And that quietness would eventually become one of the most powerful things about him. Years later, people would remember Bruce Lee for his speed, for his philosophy, for his films, for the way he moved, for the way he challenged traditional ideas. But behind all of those things was a lesson he had learned long before the world truly understood him. Don't let someone else's challenge decide your response. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove that he is strong. Sometimes the most dangerous punch is the one that never lands. And sometimes what looks like running is actually preparation. That night, 10,000 people came expecting to see a winner and a loser. Instead, they saw two martial artists discover something neither had expected. Chuck Norris discovered that Bruce Lee's speed wasn't his greatest weapon. Bruce Lee discovered that he no longer needed the crowd's approval. And the audience discovered something even more important. A fight isn't always decided by the person who hits harder. Sometimes it is decided by the person who understands the moment better. Bruce had stepped into the ring because someone said he was afraid. He left because he had nothing left to prove. And somewhere in that crowd, a little boy went home holding his worn martial arts gloves a little tighter. He didn't know how far he would go. He didn't know how many times he would lose. He didn't know how many people would doubt him. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to quit. Because Bruce Lee had taught him that night. Don't try to become stronger than everyone else. Become stronger than the person you were yesterday. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not the stopped punch. Not the roaring crowd. Not the challenge. Not even Chuck Norris. The real victory was the moment Bruce Lee realized he didn't have to fight the world to prove who he was. He only had to become the best version of himself. And once he understood that, there was almost nothing anyone could take away from him.